Hello and welcome. In this video we'll be taking an introductory look at the Imperium forces of the Grey Knights to give you some idea of what you might want to consider buying first, as well as how the Grey Knights kind of play to give you a bit of an idea if you'll enjoy the faction or not. To begin with, let's give some background of the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights are the power armor psyker army for the Imperium forces. For all intents and purposes, they are a rather elite army and make use of a rather small model range in different ways to give themselves some variety. So with that being said, I do want you to keep in mind that when you're building out a Grey Knights force, you're going to have to be a little bit content in having a somewhat small selection in terms of different model types, as most of your models are going to be building out of a couple of different kits, and as such, for some players, the army might at times feel like it looks a little bland. However, at the same time, there is the benefit that you don't have to worry too much about buying a whole bunch of different stuff, and you never know when Games Workshop will add different models to the different ranges of different armies. I don't want to say Grey Knights play the same way every time, as they actually have a decent amount of diversity in terms of how you can build a Grey Knights list, so you definitely have a lot of optionality even if you're working with only a few kits to build your different models out of. So with that being said, who are kind of the Grey Knights? Well, they're kind of similar to the Thousand Sons, who are the Psykers of the Chaos Forces, in that the majority of their units are going to have psychic powers, which isn't incredibly common for different armies to have. And in addition to that, their sub-factions, which are the Brotherhoods, offer a detachment-wide psychic power that you get access to for going into that sub-faction. And once again, that kind of plays into them being a psychic-focused army, as most armies don't get something of that nature. This does make it a little more universal and a little easier to get some value out of that psychic power, as you don't have to invest command points and you're a little less restricted on how you utilize that psychic power, so the Grey Knights definitely have a bit of a power boost in that sense. Now where they tend to differ from the Thousand Sons on the Chaos Forces is that instead of being a pro-psyker army, which benefits their ability to cast psychic powers, they're more of an anti-psyker army in that they actually gain benefits to preventing enemy psychic powers and that they gain benefits in making it harder for enemies to cast psychic powers. This means that some of their core abilities are a little more reactionary and as such are going to be a little more weaker than the Thousand Sons in that sense, as having something like a proactive static skill, which benefits what your army is already doing, is usually going to come into play more often than something that might not have any benefit in certain situations because it depends on what your opponent is playing. Think about it this way, if you're playing against an army that has no psychic powers, the Grey Knights actually don't have the benefit of that additional static ability, as the enemy has no psychic powers. But if the Thousand Sons are playing against a non-psychic army, they can still benefit their own psychic powers, and as such, they're not as reliant on their matchup in specific. More so, one thing I'll also say is that reactive abilities, such as the Grey Knights, do put them in a bit of an awkward situation, in that in many situations, a power that's more reactive and focused on countering a specific ability either ends up being a little too weak against that specific ability, or it ends up being an additional benefit that can become oppressive if the rest of the army is already good against non-psychic armies. However, I will say this, Games Workshop definitely did a rather good job in that they made the Grey Knights counter psychic powers in such a way that was minimal enough to be a nice additional perk, but did not skew games and did not force them into that situation where they either felt a little too weak against normal armies that don't incorporate psychic powers, or they inversely felt too oppressive against armies that were psychic armies. In that sense, I think that's actually a really good thing, and I think Games Workshop really found a way of making the Grey Knights very flavorful without sacrificing their playability or significantly hurting other armies in that regard. In any case, I do think all of the different special benefits are very good for the Grey Knights, and we'll cover those in a future video as the series continues, while this video is more focused on being more of a general introduction and a buyer's guide for the Grey Knights. In terms of lore, if you're interested in that kind of thing, the Grey Knights tend to be a very secretive army, and one that's not necessarily liked by many of the other factions within the Imperium due to their secrecy and due to kind of some of their behavior in the past. You see, the Grey Knights are tasked with fighting the forces of chaos, and demons are supposed to be a myth, so they don't want the general Imperium citizen knowing about the existence of demons or the chaos forces. As such, in many cases, they'll exterminate citizens who have come into contact with chaos forces and may have been perceived as corrupted even if they're still innocent and uncorrupted. In addition to that, they've had some negative run-ins with other factions within the Imperium. For example, their interaction with the Adeptus Mechanicus resulted in them stealing one of the moons of Mars, known as Deimos, and relocating it next to their home planet of Titan. And as such, this moon of Mars is now used as a forge world specifically dedicated to the psychic energies of the Grey Knight forces. More so, the denizens of the Deimos forge world are forced into mind cleansing and being kept on a very tight leash as they're working with things that are supposed to be forbidden and they cannot risk such things breaking containment, and as a result, those parts of the Adeptus Mechanicus are definitely not happy about one of their moons being stolen and their people subjugated in that regard. In addition to that, the Sisters of Battle, also known as the Adeptus Sororitas, had their fair share of negative situations with the Grey Knights. And not to get into spoilers too much, but let's put it this way, the Grey Knights at one point utilized a faction of the Sisters of Battle as a sort of meat shield with extra steps. However, by that point, the Sisters of Battle in question weren't really meat at that point, and it was a bit of a brutal situation that definitely gave the Adeptus Sororitas a rather negative impression of the Grey Knights, even though they're on the same faction. In either case, one can make the argument that the Grey Knights are a rather brutal and extreme faction. However, at the same time, considering some of the astronomical threats that they're facing against, there is some justification for the way they behave, even though it might be questionable at best, simply because of the factors involved and the risk that the enemy forces pose to the Imperium as a whole. And as such, it's up to you to decide whether you agree with the Grey Knights or not. But hey, what faction doesn't have some brutality within their lore within the 40k universe? Anyway, with that being said, let's look into the different buying options for the Grey Knight forces and how you can get the most bang for your buck in terms of building out an army for the first time. However, before we get into that, I would like to say that I've started a website that has a web store that sells the majority of these different kits that we're about to cover at a discount from Games Workshop prices. So if you're looking to pick up any of these kits, please do visit the website in the description down below, or simply visit venturetradeco.com. However, do remember I only ship within the United States, so there is a bit of a restriction in that sense. However, if you're looking for some brand new Warhammer 40k kits at a discounted price and want to support the channel, or if you're looking for a variety of different card games, do check out the website as it does help the channel out and gets you some product at a discount. Anyway, with that being said, let's move on to looking at the different kits that are pretty good purchases for the Grey Knight forces. The first kit we're going to look at is one that we're going to generally look at for most factions that we cover, that being the Combat Patrol, and the Combat Patrol comes in at $150. So what's included within the Combat Patrol, and does the value make sense? Well, to begin with, the first thing included is the HQ choice, which is a Librarian and Terminator armor, which will run you about $25 if you buy it individually. I'll say this much, the Librarian and Terminator armor isn't the most common inclusion, so it is a bit more of a fringe model, and one that you have to kind of think about, and one that you may be able to skip if you're looking at other HQ choices. So do keep that in mind, as it's going to be important once we finish looking at the other items within this kit. The next item is a kit of 5 Terminators or Paladins. This kit of 5 Terminators would normally run you $55. However, I'll say this much, once again the Terminators and Paladins are not necessarily the most impressive inclusion. However, many lists do run a unit of 5 to 10 Paladins, as they're a rather good inclusion and can do a rather good amount of work depending on the list and how it's built around them. However, some lists do definitely forgo the usage of Terminators and Paladins altogether, so once again kind of comes down to how you want to build your list and what kind of things you want to include. That being said though, I will say that the Terminators are probably a more common inclusion than the Librarian in Terminator armor. The next inclusion is a unit of 5 Grey Knight Strike Squad Marines, and this is pretty much one of the better inclusions. However, a normal box of 10 of these will cost you $65, so to be generous, a unit of 5 of them is about $32 in value. This unit is definitely going to be the all-star of the different Grey Knight army lists, as it builds into quite a variety of different units. For example, the Strike Squad builds into the Interceptors, Purifiers, and Purgation Marines, all of which are rather popular and see plenty of play within different army lists. And that being said, the primary Strike Squad might see a little less play due to the new Arc of Omens detachment and how it's structured, but even though the basic troops might see less play, the Interceptors, Purifiers, and Purgation Marines will still probably be a decent chunk of different armies going forward for the Grey Knight forces. As for the third and final inclusion within the Combat Patrol, that is a Nemesis Dread Knight kit. The Nemesis Dread Knight kit would normally cost you $65 and is a rather powerful unit for the forces of the Grey Knight. Don't forget, not only is the Nemesis Dread Knight a very good heavy support choice, but it can also build into an HQ choice known as a Grandmaster within a Nemesis Dread Knight suit. In either case, it's both a good HQ choice as well as a heavy support choice, and you'll see it rather commonly within different Grey Knight army lists, and usually you want a couple of these, so it's definitely a good inclusion and a good pickup within this Combat Patrol. With that being said, let's kind of add up what this Combat Patrol ends up costing if you bought everything individually, even though you can't buy something like a 5-man squad of Grey Knight Strike Squad Marines. If you add all these prices up, this kit would run you $177 on the low end and could probably cost a little more depending on how much you value something like that Librarian and Terminator armor, or if you place a little bit more of value on being able to get 5 Strike Squad members instead of a unit of 10 for whatever reason. As such, this is a decent enough value for a kit, but I'll say one thing, whereas some armies will be happy getting 2 Combat Patrols and making use of everything within it because of the incredible value that Combat Patrol comes in at, this one is a little bit less of a value and really hinges on how much you like that Librarian and Terminator armor. In either case, I will definitely say you want to pick up that one combat patrol, as the Nemesis Dread Knight and the Strike Squad is very good, and you can definitely find room within an army list for those Terminators, and the Librarian is pretty much a free inclusion. In addition to that, if you're looking to build a 10-man unit of either type of Terminator, and you want 2 Nemesis Dread Knights, there's definitely reason to consider buying 2 combat patrols, as you basically just get a free model in addition to what you're buying already, and you'll pretty much have some kind of use for those Grey Knight Strike Squad Marines as they build into so many different unit types. And with that being said, that's kind of how you want to consider this combat patrol, of whether or not you value those Terminators, because the value is definitely there. It's just a matter if you're going to be using some of those models, or if they're going to be sitting on the shelf. And if you want to buy the combat patrol at a bit of a discount, it can be found at VentureTradeCo.com from a discount from that $150, as well as all the other kits mentioned here, which will definitely make the value and your dollar go a lot further. In any case, let's continue looking at some of the other options you can buy when starting out a Grey Knight force if you're not interested in the combat patrol itself. We'll start off by looking at some of the kits you should buy early on if you're buying standalone kits instead of the combat patrol. For the most part, as mentioned before, the Grey Knights build out of a very limited number of different kits, so there isn't much optionality in terms of what you buy and how you build out an army. However, that being said, certain things are better to buy early on than other things. The first thing I would say that you would want to buy if you're not buying the combat patrol, or even in addition to the combat patrol, because it's such a valuable kit, is that basic Grey Knight Strike Squad kit, because remember, it builds not only into your basic troop choice, but also into interceptors, purifiers, and purgination squads, which are all incredibly popular within different Grey Knights lists and allow you to really customize how your Grey Knight army plays. This is kind of the benefit of having such a small model range, because it really gives you an ability to make some of those kits go a very long way, and gives you a lot of optionality in terms of how you play those units, even though it doesn't give you the most variety in an aesthetic sense. Anyway, moving on, the other kit you might want to consider buying very early on, and pretty much one of the only kits that you would, is once again that Nemesis Dread Knight. The Nemesis Dread Knight is definitely a very powerful unit, and oftentimes you'll see the maximum number of 3 of them within a Grey Knight's army list. That's not to say every single list is reliant on playing 3 of them, but generally you're going to see at least one within a list, and many times you'll see an additional Grandmaster in Dread Knight armor played as an HQ choice, giving you a total of 4 different Nemesis Dread Knights within a Grey Knight army list. This unit is just a very good unit, as it's rather tanky and has rather good firepower and melee capabilities depending on how you build it, and I'll definitely suggest magnetizing the weapons on it, as the weapons you want to include definitely vary depending on how you build your army list, so there's definitely a lot of optionality and a lot of different ways of playing this unit, whether it's an HQ choice or a heavy support choice. Now, speaking of different HQ choices, there's definitely a couple characters that are very popular for HQ choices for the Grey Knight army. That being Calder Drago, who is a special character for the Grey Knights and is rather powerful within the game itself. And something like the Brotherhood Chaplain and the Tech Marine definitely see play as HQ choices alongside Calder Drago and the Nemesis Dread Knight Grandmaster, as well as things like the Librarian seeing some occasional play in certain Grey Knights list. There's definitely a decent amount of HQ choices for the different Grey Knight forces, though I'll say if you're starting off, I would stick to kind of the more generic ones early on, as some of the more specialized HQ choices can be a little expensive and can be a little reliant on other forces within your list, so it might be a little harder to include them within a smaller 500-point army than it would when you're building out a 1,000-point or 2,000-point army. And as such, I think that's why the Combat Patrol is definitely a decent enough value, even if it's not the best value in the world, as it kind of gives you a nice mix of different units and different options to play around with when you're just starting out. But at the same time, you can buy a Nemesis Dread Knight and a couple of kits of those basic Grey Knight Strike Squads and build out a pretty healthy army using that Nemesis Dread Knight as your HQ choice, and relying on the different options that those strike squads can build into. And now that we've covered the kits that you would want to buy early on as well as the Combat Patrol, let's look at the kits that you might want to buy. The only kits I would say you might want to buy early on are things like the Terminators, which are a potential inclusion within different army lists, thanks to their ability to be built into Paladins, as the Paladins are definitely a decent force to be reckoned with and can definitely do a lot of damage, whether that's going into melee and just dicing up an enemy, or using a little bit more of a range mix with some of their ability to access special weapons. In either case, I wouldn't say the Paladins are something you want to start off with right away, and do consider if you're only going to be running a unit of 5 of them, you would probably want to buy the Combat Patrol before you buy a box of them individually. However, if you bought that Combat Patrol and you want to expand the unit up to a unit of 10, that's definitely when you would consider buying an additional box of Grey Knight Terminators or even a second Combat Patrol, because both those kind of make sense as an option depending on how you want to build out the rest of your army list and how your different purchases line up. In either case, I'll definitely kind of put the Terminators as kind of on the low end of the maybe, simply because the Combat Patrol is definitely an option and definitely a pretty good one, because if you want the Terminators already, it definitely makes the Combat Patrol a lot more attractive than if you're looking for generic value out of it. So that's pretty much why I would say they even might cross into the avoid territory in certain situations, but if you already have a decent Grey Knight force, there are situations where you would buy a kit of Grey Knight Terminators standalone instead of buying the Combat Patrol, because if you already have the Dread Knights that you need for your army list, the Combat Patrol isn't as interesting as well. Anyway, in terms of other things that I would say you might want to buy early on, but you might want to hold off until later, I would say the Rhino is definitely something that you'll eventually want within your list, but when you're first starting out, you might not necessarily have the units or the points to take advantage of it. Same thing with the Razorback, which is just a Rhino with some additional firepower, and can definitely be a consideration within an army list, but it's something that you might want to add when you're going to 1,000 points as opposed to buying when you're starting out a 500-point army. That being said, it is possible to include a Rhino or a Razorback within a 500-point list. It's just kind of a little bit difficult, and you might struggle to find the points in addition to everything else that you want to bring within a 500-point list. As such, I would say buy the other kits first, and then add that Rhino or Razorback to your forces as time goes on. In any case, let's look at the final category, which is things that you should probably avoid buying early on, and that's pretty much self-contained to the majority of the generic Space Marine vehicles that the Grey Knights have access to, with the exception of that Rhino and Razorback that I mentioned previously. The reason for this is most of them just aren't particularly great, and you're pretty much going to be focusing on the special options that you have access to within the Grey Knight forces. As such, the Flyers and the generic Dreadnoughts are not particularly the most exciting options for the Grey Knight forces, and currently Flyers are in a bit of a bad state, as well as constantly seeing changing rules, which makes them all the less attractive. So I'd say for the time being, avoid those options and just focus on what the Grey Knights have to offer in terms of their primary kits. In either case, I think that's pretty much everything, and that kind of gives you an idea of who the Grey Knights are, what they have to offer in a general sense, and what kind of things to maybe consider buying first, and what kind of things to avoid when starting out an army. Join me in the next video for the Grey Knights, where we talk about the special rules and the different brotherhoods that the Grey Knights have access to. After that, we'll eventually be looking at 500 point, 1000 point, and 2000 point army lists for the Grey Knight forces. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed the content, remember to like and subscribe for future content, and don't forget, visit venturetradeco.com for your different hobby and collectible needs, as we have quite a good variety with new products being added all the time. In any case, have a great day. See you next time. Bye.